Hey, welcome to the Table Talks podcast. Today we have a special At the Movies edition. For those who are new here, every summer at Echo, we do a really fun series where we unpack stories of popular films, how they connect with the human experience, and ultimately the spiritual principles that we can draw from them and what they teach us about God and His story. So today I'm here with Pastor Mandy, who taught the final week of our At the Movies series. The film we're unpacking today was a highly anticipated prequel to the magical world of chocolates and candy, Wonka.
That's right.
All right. So the story of this movie begins with Willy Wonka coming to town after spending years, right, collecting ingredients and learning about how to make candy and chocolates. And he's ready to turn his dream into a reality to have his own chocolate storefront. It feels like nothing can stop him. And then the whole movie is about everything trying to stop him.
Pretty much.
So tell me, I know this was like a movie you were really excited about.
Yeah.
What made you want to speak on it? What stood out to you about that story that made you want to unpack it further?
Yeah. Well, first thing I loved as a kid, I loved Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory.
The original one?
The original one, yes. There's some, Johnny Depp, he did okay, but I do love the original. There's a sense of, especially because it does highlight poverty the way it does, and it speaks to that. There's a sense of justice that I see throughout it. That's just, I was just reflecting as a kid how I really liked it, and I think that's the aspect I liked. And so Wonka, I remember was anticipating, well, I want to know the backstory of how he became who he became. And so there's a sense of a magical world that's like beyond what we experience, but then how did that happen? And so, yeah, it was fun to explore. I definitely came out of this process with a different conclusion than I anticipated going into it. And so that was fun just as a personal journey to kind of challenge myself. And I kind of went into it more focused on the imaginative side of like how he could create.
Song, right?
Yeah, pure imagination, like all of that. And so I actually wanted to study more that side, but then I just could not get away from this theme of generosity. And when I reflected on that more, I just saw how that seemed to be underneath the imagination. And so exploring that was really fun for me. And so I personally got a lot out of it. And so it was fun to teach about.
Yeah. So I just saw it a couple weeks ago with my kids, a little bit over their heads.
I'm sure.
There was a scene at the end where the bad guys are trying to drown Willy Wonka. The end of the movie, and my kids are like, are those the bad guys? Yes, those are the bad guys.
Yes.
So I just watched it.
Yeah.
And I watched it after actually listening you talk.
Okay. I kind of ruined it for you.
No, not really. And the theme of generosity, I don't think I would have noticed it right away until I had heard your talk about it. Yeah. And then as I listened to this and as I watched it, I realized how unbelievable it also kind of feels. Yes. Like the level of how selfless and giving he is.
Yep.
It's unbelievable, and it's also inspiring.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yep.
I'm curious why you think, or what's your thoughts on this, on why somebody who's so giving, so generous feels so inspiring for us versus the other guys, the chocolate cartel, who you could also say have developed a successful business employing most of the city.
Yeah.
Why is the other story of the guy who has nothing but gives everything that much more inspiring? Yeah. What does that say about humanity, about our condition, or maybe even God's design of us?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely so much in there. I think it's inspiring that mostly for Wonka is because he had nothing, but yet he didn't seem to be inhibited by his lack and what he didn't have, even literacy. It didn't seem to be a problem to him that he couldn't read and he almost got bit by the tiger. Like there was something in that's like, he still lived with so much freedom and like fear, like the fear that maybe crept in was only later when it was going to get in the way of a relationship. And so I think there's an aspect for him that he had experienced what I would say is God's kind of love from his mother that affected him so deeply. My conclusion would be he was seeking that through what he was doing. And that was what all of his life, it's what came out of him. Now, it's definitely unbelievable in the sense of as humans, it's like, I mean, I started to go on a small journey of like the author of this book and stuff. Like, was he a believer? Was he a Christian? Because there is an aspect that's like, I don't know if somebody could really come to those conclusions unless God was birthing it. And yet it's right there. I kept digging in and it's like, it's still unbelievable, but it's what we aspire to. And so for me, it was like in all of this unbelievable, like how can someone have nothing but be willing to give everything that they have away?
Yeah.
That's such a biblical trait that it's like, I think there's something in us that longs for that. So even if the author of this book and the story is not a believer, it just even more so shows me that God's put that in the human heart to some level, to where even in our imagination, that's what we see and dream of, like a life like that, or being treated that way, whether on someone treating us that way with that much generosity, or being willing and able to just live with this abandon and just whimsical, life. It's like, like who doesn't want that, despite whatever limitation or whatever's holding us back, that so many of us allow those things to stop us. And so just exploring that and like, man, he has nothing. He literally has nothing. And he's giving everything he has away. And so, it is inspiring. And I think it's inspiring to us because God created us like that.
The part you said about like his motivation being this pursuit of wanting to experience his mom's love again. That's powerful. That's a powerful motivator.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And not only him experience it, like he definitely wanted to experience it, but
he wants others
to experience it. And that's what's powerful. So even in that desire, it wasn't selfish. It was a selfless desire that he experienced something so deep and profound. The natural response is you have to experience it too.
Yeah.
Where greed is the opposite. It's like, I experienced that, but I'm going to hoard it and hide it and keep it to myself because it feels scarce, which is the opposite of this whole trait. And so, it's powerful.
Great. All right. So let's unpack some of your main points then.
Yeah.
Your whole message then became about how do we cultivate that kind of generosity? So how do we become Willy Wonkas?
Yes.
Right? We're not making bracelets like what would Willy Wonka do.
No.
But I'm going to go through your points of your message. You have 4 main points of how we cultivate this kind of generosity. We'll go through them one to one. I'd love for you to give me like a 2-3 sentence summary of what you mean by that.
Okay.
The first one is guard against greed.
Yeah. Guard against greed. So that's where Jesus unpacks this story. And ultimately, greed is what is the barrier to being able to cultivate this. It's like a wall.
Yeah.
And so just first of all, getting through that wall and recognizing the greed that's in our life.
Yeah.
Which I think sometimes we don't even realize is there, the greed that we have. Because ultimately in this movie kind of shows that, the rich people in the city were the greediest.
Yeah.
And so it's not about how much you have. So I get to a certain level and, all of a sudden I want to give everything away. Like, no, it shows like you can be poor and generous and you can be rich and greedy. And so just maybe really being honest and evaluating where might there be some greed in my heart or my life that I'm holding back, afraid that something's going to run out if I share it with others. So.
And every story, I mean, I think about this all the time. The bad guys usually don't think of themselves as the bad guys, right? So you're not you might not even be aware of your own greed in it, and your part in it. All right, the second point, the first one was guard against greed. Second one was invest in a rich relationship with God.
Yeah. So ultimately, I mean, I believe that this kind of character can only come with God really giving it to us. And so when we really seek God and invest in that kind of relationship with him, then he, it's kind of backwards, right? Like we guard against greed, but then we have to ask God to help us rid ourselves of it. So it kind of works together. And so, I can look in my own life about how the more I've sought God and developed that relationship, the less I want to hold on to the things that I think are important. And eventually they lose, the intensity of why I need to hold on to it so much. And so I think in that, and we see that with Wonka, and not necessarily with God. We don't know if he, had belief in God, but if you put the relationship with his mother and that kind of love, which I would say that kind of love that he experienced was a deep, profound love. It was the motivating factor for him. And so just seeing how that relationship drove his actions, it was like we can go from there.
All right, the third one was seek God's kingdom first.
Yeah. So seek God's kingdom is more about, so in cultivating a relationship is like, God, you are the most important thing, but seeking God's kingdom is, I want others to experience this kind of life. And so ultimately in the film, one of my favorite moments was the song For a Moment, because it's like Noodle is having to trust Willy Wonka in this new way of life. And he's kind of inviting her in. And as she trusts him, she starts to experience more of this generous kind of life too. But it was a risk. And I think it's important to say it does feel like a risk, because sometimes in God's kingdom, it's a little bit backwards. So you may give something away and the way it comes back to you might not be exactly the same. So seeking God's kingdom, I think ultimately we will start to see God using us to do things that he might not normally do, like what we see with Wonka in ultimately helping Noodle find her mother again. I think that's, that's the greatest part of the story.
So it seems to relate a lot to the fourth point, which is add value to those around you.
Yes. Yeah. Look for ways that we can help people. And I think this is the one where we can make it more complicated. And yet if we just step back and think, what is already within my realm of reach, and how can I share that with others instead of keeping it to myself? And that's where it kind of feels like a natural progression. If we are doing those first three things, it'll naturally lead us to open our eyes to see what we have to share with others. And so when we get to that point, I also think it's the most rewarding, because we can see how the smallest of things can really impact someone's life in a profound way. So
that's good. All right. So recap: guard against greed, invest in a rich relationship with God, seek God's kingdom first, and add value to those around you. A couple follow-ups on these. Does the order of these matter? And what relationship do those points have with each other?
Yeah. So the order is the text that I unpacked. I was trying to keep it in order of the text and the movie, which was not necessarily easy, but I was trying to keep it in order. Not necessarily do I think it has to be in that order. I think we all come to have different things. We're getting into some
weird exegesis here.
Yeah. It was a little bit of a mind exercise, which was fun. But I think, the story that I unpacked there with Jesus and the guy that came to him, it was just a scenario that Jesus was in. So as I walk through what that passage, so the way Luke structured it. So Luke has this story of the guy that asked Jesus the question, and then it goes from that question to Jesus addressing the disciples. And it's a very strange, like, chapter, because I'm thinking of Luke, like, why did he write it in that way?
Yeah.
But I'm also trying to imagine this whole scenario, and like what he's saying to the disciples is a whole lot deeper than what he's saying to the crowd around him.
Right.
And so just identifying that, there is a sense that until you have a relationship with God, some of those other things don't make sense. And I wonder if that's part of it. And so the guard against greed, I think it's not hard for most people, whether you're a Christian or not, to see that greed is not helpful and that it leads to corruption. However, the way we work that out in our lives is going to be different as far as how do we guard against greed.
Yeah.
We can guard against it with lots of policies and procedures, like what I would say the world does, like in most businesses, or we can invest in a relationship with God, which will lead to a different way of life and probably a lot less rules in our life, but a little bit more of like, you sacrifice it all and you're willing to give it all. And so a little bit different outcomes, but so I think God works wherever we are in our life. So sometimes, we might start by practicing, like, sharing with someone and realize, oh my goodness, like that there was more to that experience than just me sharing my talent. So like whether you're volunteering somewhere and you have a moment, you realize God used that experience and maybe that invites you into a relationship with God. So God can use wherever we are. There's no order, necessary, but there is a progression from when we enter a relationship with God and then seeking God's kingdom. I think those two kind of go hand in hand as we try to work that out. So
I was reflecting on the relationship between, which is kind of why I was asking that question.
Yeah,
because you could say, well, seeking or investing in a relationship with God and seeking His kingdom first, the byproducts of that would be the first, which is guard, that guards you against greed and it adds value to those around you.
Yeah.
But then I was just thinking about the opposite could be true also. Like I remember a friend in college that went on a mission trip to go do like some sort of humanitarian work, and not a Christian, but came back changed by it. Right. So they went out and added value to others. And then in response, something happened in their heart that drew them to God.
Right.
And I don't think that's uncommon.
No, right? I don't think so. And I think a lot of this has to do with our upbringing and, how we experience maybe generosity or greed. Some of us grew up even in Christian homes, but in a very scarcity-based, family maybe or surroundings. And so we don't have that natural propensity to share with others in the way that, I think there's many non-Christians who are very generous and have experienced God's abundance. And maybe they don't even connect that to God, but there is something about generosity that is like a principle in the world, like that you will experience more. And I think Wonka is an example. We don't, whether it's belief in God or not, when you invest in others, people want to share with you.
In that story, it's symbolized by this like pinnacle source of love, which to him with his mom.
Right.
And so for us, that source of love would be a love from God and ultimately the love we receive through Jesus. I think the thing that is clear, whichever direction you go in as far as the source or brings you towards God, no matter what, there's a relationship to God in these things.
Yes,
right? That's undeniable. All right, so you shared at one point the words of Jesus in Luke 12, which a lot of people know, which is where your treasure is, there your heart desire. Where your treasure is, there the desires of your hearts will be also. And you summarize it in a way that I thought was really memorable, which is what you invest in controls your heart.
Yes.
So your invitation is to invest in a relationship with God and add value to those around us. why is that something we constantly have to be reminded of? Like, why does it actually feel hard to do that if feels like it's something that God desires for us, that he's designed for us to live in? What are we battling that makes it that much more difficult?
Yeah, what comes to my mind right now is I wonder if it has to do with if until we truly experience and receive that love from God, it's not an automatic thing for us. Where that's what I think of with Wonka. He didn't have to continually remind himself, I need to be generous. He was naturally generous. And it came back to, and you see it at the end, his experience. And so his felt experience with his mom, that love, is what reminded him. And so I wonder if some of our lack of, or our need to continually be reminded is because we haven't experienced the depths of God's love for us in a way that will naturally allow some of this to be the result. And so, and I think that's what God continually wants to invite us into. And so many people come from broken homes and broken relationships. And so there's so much pain in that I think God wants to heal that. And until we allow him that place, it's going to be that need to be constantly reminded, because the pain can be it can overshadow that. And so whether it's, the enemy coming in to distract us or to put memories in our, it's like, remember who you really are, or, whatever it is, or the relationship that could be broken. But I think when we start to experience the depths of God's love, that's the reminder. And so we go back to that and let that be what propels us to live out of that. And so that's my desire for all of us who are on this journey. So
I think that's a perfect point for us to wrap up on. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for sharing that message and that movie with us, for opening up a new way to be able to see that story and for us to be able to reflect on. And that wraps up also our At the Movies series. On Sundays, we're back to our regular cadence. We have our block party that's happening this coming Sunday. We're also, for Church Online, we'll be back on our YouTube channel with our regular services, and you can join us there and continue the conversation with us. You can leave a comment right here. We'd love to connect with you. If you have any questions or something you'd like to ask, you can do it there. And also want to invite you to join our Discord community, because we have a bunch of people that are there to chat with one another, to engage, all kinds of resources that are present on there as well, and ways to be able to connect. We'd love to be able to see you there. That's it. That wraps up our time. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.